The moon of Varada was not a place that showed up on any important map. It sat quietly at the far edge of human space, orbiting a large amber gas giant that turned slowly in the dark like a sleeping giant. There were no weapons here. No warships. No soldiers walking the paths. There was a bakery, a small medical clinic, a repair depot that always smelled like oil, and long rows of garden beds that stretched out under warm artificial sun. It was a retirement colony. And it was exactly as boring as that sounds. Frank Dolan was 79 years old, and he was on his knees in the dirt arguing with a tomato plant. He had grey hair, thick hands that still looked like they belonged to a much younger and much angrier man, and a face that had been worn down by decades of things he didn't talk about at dinner. He had once commanded the entire 3rd Human Expansion Fleet. Now he commanded a garden hose and a small patch of vegetables that refused to cooperate with him. "You're going to grow," he told the tomato plant, in the same quiet voice he had once used to give orders to warships, "because I have nothing else to do today." From the other side of the low fence, his neighbor Lou Garrett let out a long, tired sigh. Lou was 76, with short white hair and one real arm and one mechanical arm he called Cleo. Cleo was a good prosthetic, precise, reliable, and strong enough to bend metal pipe with moderate effort. Lou had built her himself, years ago, and maintained her the way some men maintained classic cars. "Your irrigation line is running too far left again," Lou said, leaning on the fence. "My irrigation line is fine," Frank said, not looking up. "Your tomatoes are dying. They are resting." Lou stared at him for a moment, then shook his head and went back to his own garden, which was extremely healthy and which Frank refused to compliment under any circumstances. This was a typical morning on Varada. 2 doors down from Frank, in a small house with wind chimes on the porch, Doris Yamamoto sat at her kitchen table with a cup of green tea and an old text on her screen. She was 81 years old and had spent 40 years as a xenolinguist and intelligence analyst for the human government. She had decoded alien communications during 3 separate conflicts and had once talked an entire diplomatic summit back from the edge of disaster using nothing but careful word choices and a very calm voice. Now she translated old alien poetry for fun and baked sourdough bread that people came from across the colony to buy. She was reading a Vorath philosophical text, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she found the Vorath way of building sentences interesting. They layered meaning. A single Vorath word could carry a straightforward definition on the surface and something completely different underneath, depending on context. She liked that. It reminded her of people she had known. On the far side of the colony, near the eastern edge where the ground was flat and practical, Walt Pruitt was underneath a broken water recycler with his legs sticking out and a flashlight in his mouth. Walt was 72, the youngest of the main group, with the kind of energy that annoyed people half his age. He ran the colony's repair depot, which meant that if something broke, and things broke constantly, Walt fixed it. He fixed it fast, he fixed it right, and he usually had a joke ready when you came to pick it up. The water recycler had a cracked coupling. Walt had the replacement part in his hand before the work order was even finished being filed. At the colony clinic, Carol Nance was doing her weekly rounds. She was 77, with short silver hair and reading glasses she never seemed to wear on her face but always had somewhere nearby. She had been a field medic for 22 years before she had become a doctor, and she had seen the inside of battlefield hospitals during the worst days of the Caravan War. She had held people together, sometimes literally, under fire, in the dark, with almost nothing. Now she took blood pressure readings and argued gently with old men about their salt intake. She was good at this quiet life. She had earned it. The colony had about 4,200 people in total, most of them retired from careers in the military, medicine, engineering, or government. They had come to Varada because it was safe and warm and far from the things they used to do. Nobody bothered them here. The wider galaxy had no reason to look at this small, slow moon and think anything other than old people, vegetable gardens, nothing of interest. Which was why Pete Hale was confused by what he was seeing on his screen. Pete was 31 years old, one of the few non-retirees on the colony staff, and he worked in the communications office, a small, clean room with a big antenna array on the roof and a view of the gas giant through the window. His job was mostly routine. Weather relays. Supply ship schedules. Occasional check-ins with the human Navy's outer patrol network, just to confirm that yes, Varada was still there and still very boring. But the signal he was looking at now was not routine. He had noticed it 20 minutes ago, a tight, repeating pattern running underneath the normal background frequencies. He had almost dismissed it. Then he had looked more carefully, and his stomach had dropped in a way he didn't fully understand yet but that his body seemed to recognize as important. It was a coalition military targeting frequency. Vorath, specifically. He knew this because Doris had once given an informal lecture to the colony communication staff about alien signal patterns, just for interest, because Doris believed that useful knowledge should be shared freely. Pete had been half asleep during that lecture. He was very awake now. He printed the signal pattern, put it in his pocket, and walked as calmly as he could manage across the colony to Doris's house. She opened the door before he could knock. She looked at his face, then at the paper in his hand. She took the paper, looked at it for 3 seconds, and handed it back to him. "Come inside," she said. "Don't run on your way back to the office. Don't tell anyone else yet." She finished her tea. She put her cup in the sink. She put on her shoes. Then she walked across the colony to Frank's garden and stood at the edge of his vegetable beds and waited. Frank looked up after a moment, the way a man does when he feels someone standing nearby who is not going to say hello and leave. He looked at her face. He set down his trowel. "Frank," Doris said, very quietly, "someone just painted us." Frank stood up slowly, wiped his hands on the front of his trousers, and nodded once. He didn't ask what she meant. He had spent too many years in command rooms to need that explained. A targeting lock meant one thing. Someone was planning to hit them. Lou looked over the fence, reading the mood the way old soldiers always can, and put down his watering can without being asked. Above them, in the dark beyond the amber glow of the gas giant, 3 Vorath coalition cruisers dropped out of faster-than-light travel and took up positions in high orbit around Verada. There was no hail, no warning, no demand for surrender or communication of any kind. The first orbital strike hit the outer agricultural ring 17 minutes later. The ground shook. Smoke rose from the eastern fields. And somewhere in the middle of it all, in the quiet between the first boom and the next, Frank Dolan stood in his garden and felt something wake up in him that he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear. Something much older, and much colder than that. The shelters under Verada Colony had been built 20 years ago, during a period when human expansion had made some people nervous enough to dig deep. They were solid, well ventilated, and had enough food and water stored for 3 months. Most of the colony had used them exactly 0 times for anything other than a drill. But when the first strike hit and the ground shook and the lights flickered across every building on the surface, the 4,200 residents of Elysian Reach moved underground in under 9 minutes. 9 minutes was fast. Military fast, even. This was not a coincidence. These were not ordinary retired people who needed someone to tell them what to do in an emergency. These were people who had spent their careers in situations where moving slowly got you killed. Old instincts do not disappear just because your hair goes grey. They sit quietly, waiting, like tools stored in the back of a shed that still work perfectly fine when you finally pick them up. Carol had activated the emergency shelter protocol from the clinic the moment Doris had warned Frank. She had not hesitated. She had not stopped to double-check. She had hit the switch, put her medical kit over her shoulder, and started walking toward the main shelter entrance, directing people along the way with the calm authority of someone who had done harder things in worse conditions. By the time the second strike hit, harder this time, closer to the central housing ring, the surface was empty. Down in the main shelter hall, it was warm and dry and lit with steady yellow light. People sat on benches and low cots and folding chairs. Some talked quietly. Some didn't talk at all. A few of the older residents had brought books. One man had brought a chess set. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was crying. There was, if anything, a low and steady feeling of irritation moving through the crowd, the specific irritation of people whose quiet afternoon had been interrupted by something they were going to have to deal with. Frank stood near the center of the hall with Lou on one side and Doris on the other. Pete Hale sat at a small folding table nearby with a portable communications unit, his headphones around his neck, looking young and slightly overwhelmed in the way that people look when they realize that the calm older people around them are not calm because they don't understand the danger, but because they understand it perfectly and have simply decided not to waste energy on panic. "What do we actually have?" Lou asked. Not loudly. The way he always asked things, straight and simple, no decoration. Frank looked around the shelter slowly. "That's what we need to find out." What followed over the next 2 hours was one of the stranger inventories ever conducted in human space. Frank moved through the shelter hall and spoke to people one by one. He asked quiet questions. He listened carefully. And as he listened, The picture that formed was not what an outside observer might have expected from a retirement colony. Walt had a storage unit in the repair depot that, by colony manifest, contained agricultural survey drones. 4 of them. Medium-sized, fast, with good sensor packages. Walt explained, with a completely straight face, that he used them to check the crop fields from the air. This was technically true. It was also true that Walt had spent considerable time over the past 3 years quietly upgrading their navigation systems, their battery life, and their payload capacity. For agricultural purposes. Walt smiled when Frank looked at him. Frank did not smile back, but something in his expression shifted slightly in a direction that was not unhappy. Lou, when asked about his workshop, mentioned that he had a plasma cutting tool that he used for metalwork and sculpture. This was also technically true. Lou did make sculpture. He was not a very good sculptor. The plasma cutter was, however, military grade, from a surplus sale 15 years ago, and with adjustments that Lou had already been running through in his head for the past 40 minutes, it could be turned into a surface-to-orbit burst emitter. Not powerful enough to destroy a cruiser. Powerful enough, as Lou put it with quiet satisfaction, to ruin someone's whole afternoon. Then there was Gene Harlow. Gene was 83 years old, the oldest person in the main group, and he had the look of a man who had been soft-spoken his entire life and had found it very effective. He had been a rear admiral of a frigate squadron before he retired. He found Frank after Frank found most of the others, and he touched Frank's arm gently and said that he had something to show him. In the corner of the shelter, under a cot, Gene had a large personal storage case. Inside the case, wrapped carefully in padding, were the components of a torpedo guidance brain, pulled from a decommissioned frigate before it was scrapped, because Gene had asked for it as a personal keepsake and no one had thought to ask why a retired admiral would want that particular souvenir. Frank looked at the components for a long moment. "Does it still work?" he asked. "I test it every 6 months," Gene said simply. The colony also had mining charges. 6 of them, stored in the depot for ground clearing work. Heavy, slow, not designed to fly. But if the guidance brain was connected to them properly, and if Walt modified the charge casings to handle the stress of a guided trajectory launch, and if the targeting solution was accurate enough, Gene was already doing math in his head. Frank could see it in his eyes. Meanwhile, Dora sat down at Pete's portable communications unit and put on the headphones. She had been listening to the Vorith signal patterns since the strikes began. She had said very little since then. But after an hour of careful, focused listening, she pulled off the headphones and looked at Pete. "They haven't tightened their encryption," she said. "They're using a standard coalition command protocol. Military version from about 8 years ago." She paused. "I know this protocol." Pete looked at her. "How well?" "Well enough," she said, in the tone of a woman who had once reconstructed a complete Vorith intelligence network from 3 intercepted messages and a hunch. She asked Pete to record everything the cruisers were broadcasting. He did. She began to work. What Doris was doing was not just translation. She was reading the communication style, the rank patterns, the sentence structures, the specific command phrases that Vorith officers used when speaking to each other. It was like reading handwriting. Every branch of the Vorith military had its own habits, its own rhythms. She was learning the rhythm of Vethkor's fleet, and she was already thinking about how to use it. After 2 hours of this quiet work, Frank gathered everyone in the main shelter hall. All 4,200 of them, arranged on benches and standing along the walls, looking at him. Many of them had figured out, in that way that experienced people always figure things out before they're told, that something was being organized. The room was quiet. Frank did not give a speech. He had never been a man who liked speeches. He stood in the middle of the room and looked around at the faces, old faces, tired faces, faces that had seen difficult things and kept going anyway, and he spoke in the same voice he used in the garden. "They don't know what we are," he said. "They think they hit a soft target. Let's keep them thinking that for about another 6 hours." He looked at Lulu, gave him a small nod. He looked at Walt. Walt was already pulling on his jacket to go back to the depot. He looked at Doris. She had the headphones back on. Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted. They simply stood up and got to work, the way people do when they know exactly what they're doing and don't need to make noise about it. Above the colony, Commander Vethkor sat in his command seat and waited for the expected response. A distress signal. A surrender request. Some kind of communication from the surface. Colonies always responded. They always begged, or bargained, or at least confirmed they had heard. There was nothing. Just silence. Vethkor stared at his communication screen and felt, for the first time since arriving at this unremarkable little moon, the very faint and unpleasant feeling that something was not right. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. Walt came back from the surface covered in dust. There had been 2 more strikes while he was up there, and both of them had hit on the far western side of the colony, nowhere near the depot. He had not rushed. He had moved steadily, the way a man moves when he has a clear job to do, and panic would only slow him down. He had loaded the 4 agricultural drones onto a cart, covered them with a top, and brought them underground without incident. Then he had gone back for the tools. He set everything up in the shelter's maintenance room, a wide concrete space with good lighting and a workbench along one wall, and he started with the first drone. The drones were already well built. Walt had made sure of that over 3 years of quiet upgrades. The navigation systems were sharp, the battery life was long, and the payload cradles, officially designed to carry water testing equipment across the crop fields, had been made, through what Walt described as a series of happy coincidences, exactly the right size for other things. He removed the water testing units, set them neatly aside, and began writing new targeting code on a handheld screen. He worked through the night. He drank terrible decaf coffee from a thermos. He did not complain about the coffee. He did not complain about anything. When one of the younger colony staffers came to check on him and asked if he needed help, Walt handed the young man a screwdriver and pointed at the second drone without looking up. Across the shelter, Lou had taken over a corner of the storage room with Cleo doing most of the close work. The plasma cutter had been broken down into its main components, and Lou was rebuilding it from the inside out with a very specific goal in mind. A plasma cutter fires in a short, focused burst, useful for slicing metal. Lou needed it to fire in a longer, broader burst aimed upward at a target moving at orbital speed. These were not small changes. But Lou had been an engineer before he was a Marine and a Marine before he was a retiree, and he carried 40 years of very specific knowledge in his head like a map he never needed to look at. Cleo's mechanical fingers worked the smallest components with more precision than a human hand could manage. Lou guided her, watching, adjusting, occasionally telling her she was doing well even though she was a prosthetic arm and could not hear him. It was a habit. Old habits are hard to break. Gene Harlow worked at a folding table in the center of the maintenance room with the torpedo guidance brain spread out in front of him like a puzzle he had done before. He tested each component with a small handheld reader, and each time the reader gave him a green light, he set the piece aside carefully. When it gave him a red light, he repaired the piece himself, slowly and thoroughly, because Gene Harlow was not the kind of man who cut corners on anything that was going to fly toward an enemy cruiser. Frank came and checked on Gene at one point in the night. "How long?" Frank asked. 3 hours, Gene said, without looking up. "Maybe 2.5. Frank nodded and left him to it. Carol had set up a trauma bay at the back of the main shelter hall using 3 folding tables, every piece of medical equipment from the clinic that had been brought down before the strikes, and several bags of supplies that she had packed years ago and kept under her clinic desk out of pure professional habit. She had been in enough difficult situations to know that you kept your trauma supplies ready whether you expected to need them or not. She laid everything out with the quiet, precise movements of a person who had done this in places much worse than a dry underground shelter. Then she sat down in a folding chair, crossed her arms, and drank her own tea. One of the younger colony staff members, a woman in her late 20s named Kim, who worked in supply management and was trying very hard not to show how frightened she was, sat down near Carol and asked the question that a lot of people in the shelter were thinking. "Are you scared?" Kim asked. Carol thought about this with genuine consideration. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. She looked at her tea. Then she looked at Kim. "Honestly, honey," she said, "I've been more frightened by a bad X-ray." Kim did not look entirely convinced, but she sat a little straighter after that, which was the point. Doris had not moved from Pete's communication station in 6 hours. She had a full cup of tea that had gone cold beside her, untouched. She was deep inside the Vorath fleet's communication stream, following threads, noting patterns, building in her head a clear picture of how Vethkor ran his command and what kind of officer he was. He was cautious. He was proud. He cared a great deal about what his superiors thought of him. He used formal language even with his own crew, which told Doris something about his personality that she filed away carefully. She began to write. The message she was composing was in Vorath military dialect, not the everyday language, but the stiff, layered, formal writing style used by higher coalition command ranks when issuing priority orders. She had spent enough years reading and writing in this style that it came back quickly, the way language always does when you have known it well. She wrote slowly, choosing each word the way a careful person chooses where to step on uncertain ground. The message said, in official Vorath military form, that a priority inspection vessel had been dispatched to the Varada system and that all combat operations were to be suspended immediately pending the vessel's arrival. It carried a command authorization code that Doris partly reconstructed from memory and partly constructed from logical inference about how Vorath authorization codes had likely evolved in the past 8 years. It was a guess. A very educated one. Pete looked at the message when she was done. He looked at Doris. "If this doesn't work," he started. "Then we are in the same situation we were already in," Doris said. "Send it." Pete sent it on a spoofed command frequency that Doris had configured to appear as though it originated from the direction of the Coalition's nearest command station, 3 light hours away. The shelter went quiet as everyone who knew what had been sent waited. 12 minutes passed. Then the strike stopped. Lou looked up from his workbench. Walt looked up from his drone. Gene set down his reader. Frank, who had been standing very still near the door, turned and looked at Doris. Doris was looking at her screen, tracking the fleet communication chatter that Pete was pulling in. "He's standing down his bombardment crews," she said quietly. He sent a response asking for confirmation of the inspection vessel's arrival time. Frank exhaled slowly. "How long does that buy us?" "He'll wait a reasonable amount of time before he gets suspicious," Doris said. "Coalition protocol for this kind of order is a 3-hour window before a follow-up query is expected. He's cautious, so I expect he'll wait the full 3 hours before he starts to question it." 3 hours, Frank repeated. Walt was already back at the second drone. "Plenty of time," Walt said, without looking up. They worked. All of them, in their different corners of the shelter, did what they had spent decades learning to do. They did not waste motion. They did not repeat themselves. When one person needed something, another person had already thought of it and was on their way with it. It was not exciting. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, steady work of people who understood what they were doing and why and were not going to stop until it was done. 3 hours later, Vethkor sent a follow-up query to the Coalition Command Station asking for a status update on the inspection vessel. He was speaking to empty space. There was no ship. There never had been. Doris read his message, noted his tone, which was already moving in the direction of frustration, and began preparing the next part of what she had planned. She did not look worried. She looked like a woman who was finishing a piece of work she had started a long time ago and was nearly at the end. Above them, unaware that the silence from the surface was not silence at all, Vethkor waited in his command seat and tried to understand why a retirement colony that he had just bombed had not made a single sound. He would find out shortly. And he was not going to like it. Vethkor did not get a response. He waited another 40 minutes after his second query, and the silence from both the Coalition Command Station and the surface of Varada had taken on a quality that he did not like. He was not, by nature, an imaginative man. He believed in facts, in numbers, in things he could see on his command screen. But something about the shape of this situation, a colony that said nothing, a command station that had not confirmed a ship he had no record of being dispatched, was beginning to feel wrong in a way he could not easily name. He ordered the bombardment crews back to their stations and gave the order to resume. The strikes came down fast, harder than before. 3 direct hits on the central housing ring, 2 on the power relay network on the colony's south side. The ground shook deep underground and dust fell from the shelter ceiling in thin, pale curtains. Some of the colony's older residents pressed their hands flat on the benches, steadying themselves. Nobody ran. Nobody cried out. And then the 4th strike hit. It came down on a section of the shelter network that sat just under the southern edge of the colony, an older section, not as deep as the main halls, built in a time when the safety specifications had been a little less careful. The ceiling cracked. 3 sections of the wall came in. When the dust settled and people pulled themselves up and looked around, there were people on the floor who were not moving. Carol was already running. She arrived at the damaged section less than 2 minutes after the strike, stepping over debris, kneeling down, working. She triaged quickly and without hesitation, the way she had learned to do in field hospitals during a war that most of the people outside the shelter had only read about in history. She called for help and got it immediately. People who had worked in medicine, in rescue operations, In military, first response came without being asked, because they knew what was needed and they moved. But 2 people were gone before Carol could reach them. Hank Oller was 80 years old. He had been a cartographer, a man who had spent his career making maps of new worlds from orbit, careful and precise and steady. He had been moving toward the sound of the strike when the second section of wall came down. He had been moving toward it because that was where people might need help. That was the kind of man he was. Marge Delaney was 78. She had been a schoolteacher for 30 years, and after she retired, she had taken over the colony's morale broadcasting, a small radio setup in a secondary shelter where she read stories, played music, and kept people's spirits moving in the right direction. The secondary shelter where she had been sitting was not deep enough. She had been on air until the moment she wasn't. The main shelter went quiet for 4 minutes. Not the quiet of fear. The quiet of people who knew what loss was, had felt it before, and were choosing how to carry it. Then Carol stood up. She looked at the people around her face steady and clear, and said simply, "We keep going." And they did. Walt's drones were ready. All 4 of them sat in a launch row in the maintenance room, reprogrammed, retooled, and waiting. Their sensor jamming packages had been confirmed active in a quiet test run, and their formation coordination, the ability to move and respond as a single unit rather than 4 separate machines, had been locked in. They would not destroy anything. That was not the point. They would blind the cruiser's targeting arrays and scramble their close-range sensor networks, and they would do it from multiple angles at once so that no single point of origin could be targeted in response. Lou's emitter was ready. It sat in a reinforced cart near the main shelter ramp, wired to a power unit that Walt had stripped from one of the depot generators. Lou had tested the output twice and adjusted the spread calibration both times until it matched exactly what he needed. When the emitter fired, it would send a directed burst of concentrated plasma energy into a target at orbital height. It would not punch through a cruiser's armor plating, but it would hit the communication array on the outer hull like a hammer on glass. Lou had very clear feelings about Vethcor's communication array. Gene Harlow's 2 guided mining charges were ready. Gene had connected the torpedo guidance brain to both of them in a series configuration that allowed shared targeting. Both charges would lock onto the same trajectory data and fly as a pair, separated by 8 seconds. The idea was simple. The first charge would test the cruiser's close defense response, and the second charge would fly through the gap that the first one opened. Gene had explained this to Frank using a pencil and the back of a shelter supply list, drawing the flight path in careful lines. Frank had nodded. Gene had folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Those are for Hank and Marge," Gene said quietly. Frank put his hand briefly on Gene's shoulder, and then they both went back to work. The drone swarm launched from the surface through 4 maintenance shafts that Walt had identified on the shelter schematics as being wide enough. They came up fast and spread out immediately, rising toward orbital height on the far side of Verada's curve before they curved back in toward the 3 cruisers from directions the cruiser sensors had not been looking at. The effect was immediate. Vethcor's command screen lit up with alerts. His targeting system started receiving contradictory data. His sensors were seeing 5 things in 4 different places that could not all be real at the same time. He ordered a sensor recalibration, which took 3 minutes, and while his crews were working on that, Lou's emitter came out of the surface access shaft on the colony's north side and fired. The burst hit the second cruiser's communication array at almost exactly the angle Lou had calculated. The array went dark. The second cruiser dropped off the fleet communication network. Its crew scrambled to switch to backup systems, which took time, and during that time the 3 cruisers could not coordinate with each other. Then Gene's first charge launched. It flew clean and straight and hit the deflection shield of the smallest cruiser head-on. The shield held, but the impact triggered the cruiser's automated close defense response, a spread of counter-projectile fire that burned out in under 10 seconds. 8 seconds after the first charge hit the shield, the second charge arrived through the empty corridor left by the depleted defense response. It hit the lower drive section of the smallest cruiser just below the main engine housing. The cruiser did not explode. It went quiet. Its drive systems shut down in the way that systems shut down when they are badly damaged and the safety protocols kick in. It began to drift slowly out of its orbital position, no longer under control, moving away from the other 2 ships. The 2 remaining cruisers had to break their bombardment formation to maneuver away from the drifting vessel. For the first time since arriving at Verada, Vethcor's fleet was not in a position to strike the surface safely. Frank watched the data coming in from Pete's communications intercepts and felt the shape of the moment shift. He picked up the open channel transmitter. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way he had always spoken when he wanted someone to understand that he was being completely, entirely serious. He gave his old rank and his full name. He explained, briefly and clearly, exactly what the colony had done over the past several hours. He named the intelligence leak. He confirmed that the colony had been listening to every communication the fleet had sent. He described, in general terms, the capabilities that had just been demonstrated. And then he gave Vethkor a choice. Withdraw now, Frank said, or be the commander who lost 3 cruisers to a retirement colony. Your fleet doesn't know what you've walked into. Your command doesn't know what you've walked into. You can leave and file a report that says whatever you need it to say. Or you can stay, and what happens next will be very difficult to explain to anyone. He set down the transmitter. The shelter was silent. Pete had both hands flat on the table, watching his screen. Lou stood with his arms crossed. Gene sat with his hands folded, very still. A long silence came from the fleet channel. Then Doris, headphones on, held up one hand. She was listening. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, and she reached for her pen and wrote a single phrase on a notepad and turned it to show Frank. It was in Vorith. Frank couldn't read Vorith. He looked at Doris. Unfavorable engagement conditions, she said, quietly. He's ordering withdrawal. The shelter exhaled. Not all at once. It came out in pieces, in slow breaths and quiet sounds, and 1 or 2 people sitting down heavily on benches as if their legs had decided that was enough standing for one day. Carol looked up from her trauma bay, read the room, and nodded once to herself. Lou uncrossed his arms. Gene Harlow looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at the floor, and then closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. Frank said nothing. He walked back to the corner where he had been standing most of the night and sat down on a supply crate and looked at his hands. They were still the hands of an old man who had been gardening that morning. They were also, he reflected, still exactly what they had always been before the garden. Above them, the 3 Vorith cruisers began their withdrawal calculations. The damaged vessel was taken under tow. The fleet moved. Within 2 hours, they were gone. The amber gas giant turned slowly overhead, indifferent and enormous. Varada's surface was quiet. The smoke from the outer fields had thinned and the stars were visible through the dust. Hank and Marge were gone. That would not change. But the colony was still there. The morning after the Vorith fleet left, Frank went back to his garden. Most of the surface was still standing. The outer agricultural ring had taken the worst of the bombardment. The crop fields were scorched in long black lines and 3 of the storage sheds were completely gone. Some of the housing on the south side had damage. The power relay network was running on backup. But the central colony, the clinic, the bakery, the repair depot, and most of the residential paths were intact. Varada was broken in places. It was not gone. Frank stood in his vegetable beds and looked at his tomato plants. They had survived. This was either very good luck or confirmation that the tomatoes were, as he had told them, simply resting. He chose to believe the second option. He got on his knees and checked the soil. Lou appeared at the fence 10 minutes later. Your irrigation line shifted in the shakes, Lou said. I know, Frank said. You want me to fix it? I can fix my own irrigation line. Lou leaned on the fence. You did good last night. Frank patted the dirt. We all did. Lou looked out at the scorched fields in the distance. Hank would have complained about losing those crops, he said, after a moment. He liked the potato harvest. He did, Frank agreed. They stayed quiet together for a while, which is sometimes the only right thing to do. The human Navy arrived 31 hours after Frank had triggered the emergency beacon. Not because the beacon had called for help in the traditional sense. It had broadcast the intelligence package that Dora scattered, buried inside the carrier signal, coppered directly to human military intelligence channels. 3 Navy frigates and a full carrier group dropped into the system and found a slightly scorched moon, a drifting debris field where 1 Vorith mining charge had been intercepted by orbital counter-defense that someone had quietly reactivated, and 4,198 calm elderly humans who had already filed a complete damage report. The Navy commander who came down to the surface was a Rear Admiral named Greg Ashby. He was 44 years old, which in this context was quite young, and he had been briefed during the transit on what had happened at Varada. He had read the brief twice. He had still not been entirely sure what he was walking into. He walked into the main shelter hall, which smelled like coffee and engine oil and the particular brand of collective exhaustion that comes after something difficult is over. He saw the drone launch cradles in the maintenance room. He saw Lou's emitter on its cart. He saw the wall near Pete's communication station, which was covered floor to ceiling in printed Vorith signal intercepts that Doris had annotated by hand in 3 different colors of pen. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, taking all of it in. Then he found Frank, who was standing near the back wall with a cup of coffee, and he looked at him carefully. Frank looked back without any particular expression. "Admiral Dolan," Greg Ashby said, using the old rank without being asked, because the situation seemed to require it. "Do you have anything you want to say for the official record?" Frank thought about it. He drank his coffee. "Put down that the colony's drainage system still needs fixing," he said. "We were going to get to it before all this started." Greg Ashby looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote it down. He was not sure why, exactly. It seemed like the right response to the moment. What followed in the weeks and months after was a complicated and careful process of deciding what would be known and what would not. Both the human government and the Vorith coalition found themselves in agreement, for entirely different reasons, that the incident at Verada should be classified at the highest level. The human government did not want it widely known that a retirement colony had been bombed without a defensive response arriving for 31 hours. The Vorith coalition did not want it known that 3 cruisers had been driven off by 4,200 retirees with modified farming equipment. Both sides issued quiet statements through diplomatic channels. Both sides agreed to say very little. Both sides understood, without discussing it directly, that this was the arrangement that worked best for everyone officially involved. Unofficially, the story moved through the galaxy like water finding cracks in stone. Slowly, quietly, in pieces. Someone told someone who told someone else. Vorith crew members who had been on those cruises said things to friends, who said things to others. A retired human intelligence analyst with a pen name won a small literary prize for a poem in an obscure journal about what it means when silence speaks louder than weapons. Nobody connected the poem to anything publicly. People who knew, knew. Lou's emitter design was catalogued and quietly studied by Navy engineers who found the technical documentation in the damage report. A new class of surface defense emitter, developed 18 months later, bore certain specific design features that bore a strong resemblance to Lou's work. The credit in the design files read derived from field innovation, source unspecified. Lou found this out through a contact who still owed him a favor, and he did not seem bothered by it at all. He had not built the emitter for credit. He had built it because it needed to exist. Walt went back to the repair depot. There was more work than usual. The colony needed a great deal of fixing, and Walt moved through it methodically, starting with the most critical systems and working outward. He hired 3 of the younger colony staff as part-time assistants and taught them things that were not in any standard repair manual, because Walt believed that knowledge passed on was knowledge kept. Carol submitted a medical paper about emergency trauma response under conditions of complete resource scarcity. She wrote it in plain, direct language, without drama, describing the decisions she had made and why she had made them. It became required reading at 3 human medical academies within 2 years. She was invited to lecture. She declined the first 2 invitations and accepted the third, because the third was at a school that specifically trained field medics, and she felt those were the right people to talk to. Gene Harlow named the tomato plant he grew the following spring after Marge Delaney. It was a good variety, deep red, sweet, with a long growing season. He gave the seeds to several other residents at the end of harvest, so the plant kept growing in other gardens, which seemed right. Doris never went back to intelligence work, despite being asked twice through official and 1 unofficial channel. She wrote her poetry. She baked her bread. She kept the annotated Vorith signal intercepts on her wall at home, not out of pride, but because she was still working through the analysis and she liked to have her work where she could see it. She told Pete, when he asked her why she had kept the printouts, that every piece of communication tells you something about the person who sent it, and she had not finished learning everything Vethcor's signals had to say. Pete Hale filed a request for permanent transfer to Elysian Reach Colony 2 weeks after the Navy departed. He expected the request to sit in a queue for months. It was approved within 3 days. He was not told why, officially. He suspected someone had made a call. He did not ask. He unpacked his things into a small house near the communications office and became a permanent part of the colony in the easy, natural way that some people become part of a place, as if they had always been meant to end up there. 6 months later, a young journalist arrived at Verada. She had followed a trail of third-hand information and half-overheard conversations across 4 different systems, and she was not entirely sure she had the right place. But the colony matched the details she had gathered, and the amber gas giant overhead matched the one she had dreamed about after reading the intelligence gossip that had filtered into certain specialist circles. And when she asked at the small colony welcome office if a Frank Dolan lived here, the woman behind the desk smiled in a particular way that meant yes without saying it. She found Frank in his garden. He was on his knees in the soil, pressing seeds into the ground one at a time with his thumb, moving slowly along the route the way a man moves when he has no reason to hurry and every reason to do the job right. He did not look up when she stopped at the edge of the garden path. She asked him if the rumors were true. She asked him how it was possible. She asked him how a group of retired people with no military hardware had faced down a 3-ship coalition strike force and won. Frank sat back on his heels. He brushed the soil from his hands. He looked at the row of seeds he had just planted and seemed to be thinking about them rather than about her question. Then he looked up. "We didn't do anything special," he said. "We just didn't panic. We didn't forget what we knew. And we were very, very annoyed." He pressed the last seed into the ground and patted the soil flat with the palm of his hand. "Also," he added, not looking up again, "Lou built a good gun." The journalist stood there for a moment, her recorder running, not entirely sure what to write down and what to leave out. From the other side of the fence, without turning around, Lou Garrett called out, "Write down the part about the gun. That part's true." The journalist wrote it all down. Frank went back to his gardening. The amber gas giant turned overhead, slow and warm and permanent, the way it had turned before any of this happened, and the way it would keep turning long after all of them were gone. Verada was quiet again. It was, if anything, even more peaceful than before. Some places are like that. You try to break them, and they simply become harder to break. You try to frighten the people in them, and the people simply remember who they were before they were old, and they act accordingly. The galaxy, for the most part, did not learn this lesson quickly. But it did learn it.